The rematch just happened, and Nate Diaz officially won the fight on the scorecards. One judge gave it a draw, another one gave it 97-93 for Nate, and then 98-92 for Nate. It was a great fight, a lot better than I expected it was going to be. These guys are much older, and they just stood toe-to-toe, throwing shots back and forth, a ton of volume from Nate, and a lot of power punching from Jorge Masvidal. And that's why I thought that Jorge probably should have won the fight, because he was landing on Nate with much harder shots. That chin is unreal. I don't know how the guy's able to still take damage like that. Nate was getting clobbered by some of those punches, man. That left hook especially, when Jorge's back was close to the ropes, he threw a right hand and then left hook, landing clean on Nate Diaz, but the guy just walks right through all those punches. I don't know how, after all these years, now at 39 years old, after taking so many punches to the head in his MMA fights, the guy still seems so unfazed from clean shots landing on him. Now that goes to show you how hard Jake Paul hits, because Jake actually dropped Nate Diaz with a big shot, whereas Jorge Masvidal could not do the same thing. Now we do have to remember that Jorge is a natural orthodox fighter, right hand dominant, but some of his biggest punches were landed with his left hand, which is not as dominant. And we don't normally see Jorge fight in the southpaw stance, so maybe he wasn't comfortable enough throwing his hardest punches with his left hand like that, and that could be the reason that Jake Paul was hitting harder than Jorge, but I do think that Jake naturally punches harder than Jorge Masvidal, and he's probably a better boxer than Jorge as well. Jorge's 39, he's not in his prime anymore, he's not as fast as he used to be, but the guy's still game, man. Going back and forth with Nate like that was very entertaining, very exciting stuff, but this may be the reason as to why he lost on the decision. We have to remember that boxing scoring is not like MMA. The scoring systems are completely different. Now, they do take similar kind of variables into factor, like damage from punches, ring control or cage control in MMA, aggression, volume punches, all this stuff. So they do have similar kind of variables, but they order it a lot differently. In MMA, damage trumps everything when it comes to striking. So if Jorge's landing these big punches on Nate Diaz, he'd be winning those rounds. If they fought in MMA and they were just boxing with each other like that, Jorge absolutely would have won that fight, 100%. He landed the biggest shots of the fight, in most of the rounds as well. And then aggression comes after, that's not looked at all until effective striking is equal. And then cage control comes last. But in boxing, it's all put together. When they score fights in boxing, they're looking at everything. They're looking at powerful punches landed, they're looking at volume, they're looking at ring control, they're looking at aggression, they're even looking at defense. And then you probably wonder, what is the number one criteria then? What are they looking at as the number one thing in the fight? As far as I know, I may be wrong on this, but apparently they don't really look at anything as a number one criteria. So boxing judges can differ on what they want to score in the fight as the number one criteria. Some boxing judges look at defense as the number one criteria. Some boxing judges look at volume. Some boxing judges look at ring generalship and aggression. Some boxing judges look at damage. They all kind of differ because of the way that the scoring system is written. It's written in a way that is taken into interpretation. Whatever the boxing judges specifically will view differently from each other. And that's why you see a lot of times in boxing, the scorecards are so vastly different from each other. You got one guy giving it a draw, you got another guy scoring almost every round for one boxer, then another scoring the entire fight for the other boxer. It's crazy that one of these boxing judges can score that fight as a draw, and then another boxing judge gives Nate Diaz 8 rounds out of the 10. Some of those rounds are really close. Theoretically, if every single round was close, you could give most of those rounds to Nate Diaz. But I don't think, in my opinion, they were as close as the boxing judges were making it seem. The fact that you could give Nate Diaz that many rounds is kind of crazy. But that's essentially the difference between MMA and boxing scoring. The only thing that the boxing judges have to abide by, or I guess one of the things, is that a knockdown is going to be an automatic 10-8 unless the guy who got dropped can come back and do something big in return to make it a 10-9 against them. Some big comeback like that, So most of the time, a knockdown is going to score that round as a 10-8. That's something that the boxing judges have to do. Everything else, or most other things, are pretty much up to how they see it. Defense, aggression, ring control, volume punches, how effective the punches are actually landing, how many punches they are landing in general. There's a lot of stuff taken into consideration for scoring a boxing fight. And Nate Diaz was landing a lot of volume, and he was slapping up Jorge Masvidal with a bunch of punches, and maybe that's why a couple of those judges scored the fight for Nate. But I was surprised that none of them scored it for Jorge. None of the boxing judges scored those power punches landing as much as they did for the volume punches from Nate Diaz and the ring control. We do have to remember one thing here. Jorge, even though he was landing big punches, his back was up against the ropes for most of that fight. And if the boxing judges see it that way, even though Jorge's landing the bigger shots, because he's getting backed up the whole fight, Nate is controlling the ring, and he's being the aggressor, they could score the rounds for him. So yeah, I found that kind of crazy, man. I thought at least one of them had to score the fight for Jorge. The fact that none of them did is wild. And that's why, even though we talk a lot about MMA scoring and how much that needs work, boxing scoring is just way worse, in my opinion. And it's always been like that, it's always been much worse. But now we're probably going to see a trilogy between these two. Jorge won in MMA, Nate won in boxing, and they're probably going to have the trilogy in like wrestling or something, I don't know, or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, if they just like do crossover sports with each other. But I do see Jorge Masvidal as the better fighter between them two, both in MMA and in boxing. That's how I see it, at least. I like Jorge's skills better than Nate's. I thought he won the boxing fight. He was winning the MMA fight. In a jiu-jitsu contest, maybe Nate would get him. In a wrestling contest, maybe Jorge would beat him. But I would imagine they would have a third fight in boxing, if we're to be honest. Earlier that night, Chris Avila beat Anthony Pettis, which was kind of surprising considering that Anthony Pettis didn't look that bad against a very old Roy Jones Jr. But the fight wasn't as exciting as the main event was at all. Man, that is crazy to see Anthony Pettis actually lose to Chris Avila in any combat sport, honestly. Anthony Pettis was once the face of the lightweight division. He was on the Wheaties box, putting on good performances. Everybody used to talk about him. And now he's losing a boxing match to Chris Avila. That's crazy, man. And so was the Darren Till boxing match as well, where that guy's opponent got tapped in the back of the head very lightly. And bro was milking it and still lost because of TKO. And once he lost, this guy got all butthurt. He wanted to fight Darren Till again. Darren Till countered him with a left hand, hands down and everything. Darren should have just threw a flying knee or a head kick or something. Put that guy away with it. What is he doing trying to fight with Darren after the fight is over, after the contest is over? He tried to get that sweet DQ win. They scored it as a loss for that guy, and he tried to fight Darren after. That's so crazy. Bro really could have got flying kneed or head kicked, because once the boxing contest is over, if he's attacking Darren Till, it's not a boxing fight anymore. Bro's got shoes on now too. Can you imagine? I mean, look at that angle. Darren could have easily brought up that shin right from there, but I think his brain was still thinking about boxing, His opponent showed better fight IQ even after the boxing match was over. Like, say what we want about Darren Till's MMA career and like what he was able to do recently over there. That man was very lucky Darren did not let those knees and kicks fly at him, or some of those elbows in the clinch. But the crazy thing was, Darren Till, because he didn't do any of that stuff, Darren got wrestled, taken down on the canvas by that scrub. How are you getting wrestled by him? His wrestling has gotten worse to where now cab drivers are taking him down. Like, what is going on with Darren Till, man? Darren Till and Nate Diaz are calling out different opponents. They want to fight like Jake Paul and stuff, and I don't think Jake Paul wants to fight Nate or Darren Till. I don't think he cares to. Right here, he beat Nate before. Nate also called out Leon Edwards. They fought before, and on paper, Leon won, but everybody walked away from that fight as if Nate won the fight. But who knows, man? Maybe Mike Perry becomes the new dog in the yard if he beats Jake Paul. Do you know how crazy that would be? If Mike Perry beat Jake Paul after all of that, the king of Africa, man, he's got to pull it off. If he beats Jake Paul, he's the GOAT. The only one that could trump that is if Alex Pereira beats John Jones, or Stipe beats John Jones. So a big day for boxing, and leave in the comments below what you guys think of it. What you guys think of the Darren Till fight and the Nate Diaz and Jorge Masvidal fight? Was it better than you expected? Who do you guys think won the fight? And what do you make of Darren Till's takedown defense, even in the sport of boxing? And I'll see you guys in the next video.